Welcome to Taxpayer Empowerment. I'm Jose Melendez, Campaign Director for the Taxpayer Protection Project here at TPPF. Today we're talking about some of the biggest issues facing Texans. From runaway local spending to sky-high property taxes, the fight for fiscal freedom continues. We're joined today by Representative Hillary Hickland, a mom of four, a fierce taxpayer advocate who's been leading the charge for fiscal responsibility and parental rights in the Texas House. Representative Hickland, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
One thing that I believe we need to make a huge emphasis on is bond elections, and maybe a greater emphasis on how that affects the individual taxpayer. So on that note, there's two bond elections coming up in your district. Temple ISD, which is proposing a $122 million bond, and Belton ISD that's got a $161 million bond. Of those two, can you just give us a synopsis and just a walkthrough what they mean for the taxpayer in your district?
Sure. Well, when it comes to our property taxes, for the most part, the average Texan doesn't understand why their bill keeps going up and where is the disconnect? How is this happening? And it is a concern for every property owner. I mean, it is the issue that I heard as much as concerns for our border. So it's a big focus. And one of the areas that is pushing those property bills higher and higher are these local bond elections. And honestly, we can boast about the Texas miracle and how great our economy is right now, but the capital outlay, meaning this local government debt, is the anchor that will sink the ship, and we've got to sound the alarm.
Excellent. Just as a follow-up, so we're talking about how this might affect the personally the taxpayer, right? When we think about these bond elections, most of them think, well, how is this actually going to affect me?
Sure.
Should there be some sort of like price tag on the ballot, like that tells you this is the average you expect to pay as an individual taxpayer?
There has to be. So the reality is that every bond is a tax increase. And that's one of the reasons that the legislature insisted that statement be on the ballot, because even with a lower dollar amount, your property tax bill is still higher than it would have been if the bond didn't pass. And that's as simple as we can put it, is to say this is a tax increase. So, there are so many, it's emotional because we're talking about our kids, about schools, about facilities, the future. A lot of times the schools are where the community gathers. It's a source of pride. But as that translates to the individual household, what does this mean? And a lot of times these bond elections are passed by a handful of votes and can saddle a community with hundreds of millions of dollars in debt that takes decades to pay off. So it's something that we really have to take more seriously as we look at the process of how bonds are proposed, where those funds are being allocated, and what are they for. At its inception, a bond is intended to be for a specific purpose, should be ideally short term. This is not a long-term process that we put this increase into perpetuity, that we're always going to pay it, or as soon as we buy down a certain amount, then that just means it gives us a gap that we could pass another bond, that we never get out of debt. It's just like we make room to pass another bond. And unfortunately, too often, and especially recently, a lot of the bond funds and the projects are being used for maintenance and operation expenses that are really intended to be part of their regular budget, which is why M&O stands for maintenance and operations. But a lot of those requirements are being shifted over into a bond, and your average taxpayer doesn't have the desire or the bandwidth to dig into those details. And so it really is up to the state to establish some kind of standard or protection for taxpayers that are just trying to raise their family, just trying to pay off their house and live.
Can you expand upon the way Temple ISD has gone about, instituting their bond proposition?
It all comes down to the process. Temple ISD, like I said, we're a growing area and there is a need. And so they opened up the process to this bond committee, to the entire community. And they had community input from 85% of community members versus school district employees. The process was completely transparent, and also they allowed it to be altered rather than having a pre-selected endpoint. They really wanted that transparency and the community engagement involvement. They shared with the community, they laid it out. Here's our issues, here's the needs. Now you tell us, what do you think fits within this budget, and what can we work on? And so they opted out of a total new building and decided to expand with the need, and they took into account revamped demographer reports that show a decrease in enrollment in some areas. And so that is how you're going to partner with the community and regain trust, so that, sure, there is a time to pass a bond, but all the community should come together and agree, yes, we are consenting to this increase in taxing for the sake of the community and the future of our schools in our district. So it's all comes down to that transparency and that open feedback, rather than a hand-selected process that's almost curated to come about of a pre-selected result.
So in that lane, talk to us about how the community back home in your district is engaging these bonds.
Well, not everybody is for it, but they don't feel the freedom to speak openly about it. Specifically, in the case of the Belton ISD bond, I have heard from multiple constituents who have concerns about coming out and sharing their perspective of being against the bond. We talked about being seen as anti-kid, but it's even more than that. So there are employees of the district who see misallocation of funding, bloated administrative salaries, maybe superfluous positions, because they're in the mix and they see how the funds are being used currently, and they don't have confidence that more funds will be allocated responsibly. However, they anticipate real retribution by sharing openly an opinion of even asking questions or pushing against a bond or encouraging other people who have concerns to vote against it. So there is an employee of a business owner in the area who could possibly benefit from a contract and bond funds. This employee was sharing concerns about the bond that were negative, and her employer told her that if she didn't remove those posts, that she'd be fired. It gets into the free speech, but also an employer has the freedom to hire and fire. But it just goes to show that there's not that unified support, and actually the stakes are pretty high. If there are local business owners that come out against the bond, we know that some of these consultants that are tasked with promoting the passage of the bond will do opposition research on those business owners. We also know that there have been Facebook accounts that have been taken down because of claims that they're violating community standards, when really they were just speaking against the bond. But those are things that are hard to go back. It's an inconvenience, and especially in the time of an election where you want to reach out to your community and like-minded neighbors and members of your community to share your concerns. So that's real. And I think that provides, it challenges even footing when it comes to a educated electorate or even free speech. There was one other case of intimidation, and it has to do with a business owner who was contacted by a member of this pro-bond PAC that makes up, local community members who basically said, you need to go vote for this bond. We're reaching out to all of our contacts and we're watching the voter rolls, which is public information. Obviously, they can see if you voted, but not how you voted. Regardless, they are contacting these people and also to tell them, well, if this bond passes, then we all make money. And so it just goes to show that this is can be predatory and really anything other than what's best for the kids, and kind of an agenda that's being sold, unfortunately.
Are there any legislative measures that have been presented in the past, or do you see any that might be coming up next session to address that?
Well, we filed, we meaning my team, we filed a bill that would break down what the difference would be if the bond passes versus if the bond doesn't pass, just so that the average voter can see on the average home, your homestead, what your bill would look like if this bill passes and if it doesn't, because we all just need informed consent when it comes to how we're taxed. Fundamentally, I think it's wrong to increase taxes on voters without their approval. And so how do we break down that information so that it's easily understood and digestible to Texans? So that was one idea. The other idea is that, unfortunately, this bond process is really susceptible to profiteers, from architects to developers to even local builders and contractors, that it's being promoted and advertised and essentially sold to the voters with tailored facts that are obviously for the good things that the bond will do, while leaving out how much debt, the real cost of what it will be. And the problem is that these groups that are essentially PACs to promote the passage of the bond, essentially selling it, advertising it, often those are the same people that will benefit from the bond funds. That is self-dealing. That is a conflict of interest. And I think that we have to pass legislation to prevent that.
So let's dive deeper into that. Two things that come to mind is a lot of the times the messaging to that end is think about the children.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Number one, how do you combat that? And number two, what are some of those legislative measures that we can use to address that problem?
Like, everybody likes nice things. Everybody likes something new, cutting edge. But too often, these projects are related to aesthetics versus how does this improve outcomes? We have to make sure that each one of these measures is actually focused on the kids. Where you can say it's for the kids, but does it really translate to that? And too often it doesn't. So it's not that if you are pushing against a bond, it's not that you're anti-kid, it's that you're pro-taxpayer. You're pro the future of your community. So many of our seniors are on fixed incomes, and we're working very hard at the state level to expand those property tax exemptions, only to see those the relief, those gains eaten into. It's like these bonds being pushed so frequently, they're opportunist. It's opportunistic to say, hey, well, the state just gave them a big refund, so they won't notice if we pass this bond. And it's a real problem. And it, unfortunately, the emotion that comes along with, well, yeah, we want our kids to be safe. Well, yeah, we want our kids to have the latest technology, although that doesn't necessarily translate to real outcomes. And a lot of things can be sold as safety when it's really, yes, it meets the standards. We just want this to look nicer. And those are things that we have to communicate to the voters and let them decide if this is really worth going into debt until the children that it serves are 40 years old by the time we pay this off. I mean, that's how long-term this debt is on communities.
So let's touch on something you mentioned. You talked about tax relief. So there's a dynamic at play, right? The state sends tax relief, local governments see it as an opportunity to raise taxes or pass a new bond. If you will, talk to us about, because it's seemingly like you take one step forward and then one step back when local governments come in and pass these new bonds or tax raises. How do we address that problem?
There has to be some kind of parameters where we put restrictions on bonds, that they're only in a case of necessity. In my district, we are fast growing. We do have a lot of people moving into our area. Schools do need to grow with the population, with the need. But it's really important to take all of that into consideration and make sure that it's not beyond what we need, and that it's serving its function. It does feel like we're spinning our wheels, here at the state, and there's such a disconnect. That's one of the things that I've noticed is, unfortunately, a lot of ISDs are kind of, there's dissonance in that relationship between ISDs and the state. And rather than work together, there's this, it's almost adversarial to say, hey, we did all this for our schools, we did all this for our community, not so that you can jump in and be opportunistic in this situation. We've got to get that relief to the property owner, and not create opportunity for it to be taken advantage of. So when it comes to how do we prevent it, there's educating the voters. I think it's possible that it could be measures like where we have elections all at the same time instead of these off-cycle elections.
So to that point, the governor's mentioned that before, where uniform election date, bond approval threshold. This past special session, there was local spending limits. So there's a host of reforms out there. How do you think we engage the legislature to move on these reforms next session?
Well, I'll file them. I'm willing. I think they're great ideas, and we have to do something, because as much as there's a desire to eliminate property taxes, with every bond that we pass, we're so much farther from that goal. And because you can't forgive debt that was taken on by voters, even if it is a small percentage of the voters. That's just how the system is designed. And so maybe that voter threshold, that it has to meet some kind of percentage of the population, or some kind of threshold. There really needs to be reform when it comes to collective debt.
So let's take a moment to talk about something you've spoken before about, and this is the practice of taxpayer-funded lobbying, which also gets these issues, because a lot of times these contract lobbyists, the associations such as TASB, TML, are usually coming out against the very reforms we just talked about, right? Bond threshold approvals, uniform election date. If you go through TASB's advocacy agenda, they are literally coming out explicitly saying we are against these reforms. So take a moment, because they spend millions of dollars every legislative session opposing the very things that would help Texans. From your perspective, how do we ensure that this practice stops next session?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's a huge problem. When I talk about the dissonance between the local entities and the state, these groups are a main driver of that, because in their conferences, they're actively trying to stir up this adversarial relationship of, well, here's how you push against this, and they're against you because of that, and this is why you need us up there fighting for you, when really there's no way that these taxpayer-funded lobbyists can accurately reflect the individual aspects of each community value. They don't live in our district. They don't shop at HEB with us. They don't know our what makes our community unique and what we care about. They're essentially hired mercenaries. And honestly, it's unnecessary, specifically because I hand out my personal cell phone number to the elected officials on every city council, all the county commissioners have my cell phone number. The school board trustees, I make myself readily available so that when they have an issue or they see something that will affect them, they can reach out to me. And in the same way, when I see legislation that's coming up, I'll reach out to them as well. That's how it's intended to work in a representative government. But when you get these outsiders coming in to really put their hand to the wheels of government, then they can adjust it in a way that benefits them. And ultimately, it's been in favor of the institution rather than the children, the students, the communities. And it's a big budget item, which is one of the things that you mentioned. So when we're talking about how do we reduce property taxes, well, the quickest way to property tax reduction is a budget cut. And that's at the state level. It's at every level. It's also at the local level. And one huge line item is taxpayer-funded lobbying. It's unnecessary. And this isn't, I want to make the distinction also between, you can have advisory boards, boards that say, hey, keep anybody that's a county commissioner or overseeing a port should look at this bill. But honestly, I say AI is so advanced. And even before that, you can, the TLO, the website is incredibly user-friendly. Just as a stay-at-home mom, I was able to find out, well, when are the education bills being heard or what bills are being filed and moved and how can I engage in that way? And so it's not hard and it can be free. And so for any local taxing entity that's looking for a way to save money, I highly encourage focusing on those taxpayer-funded lobbying as a number one thing to cut.
So on that note, you think about some of the opposition to these bills. A lot of times it's those local elected officials, mayors, county judges. And a lot of times they'll say, well, hey, I'm from a small county. We don't have the resources to pay a lobbyist. How do you respond to those folks?
Call me. Here's my number. We live in the same community. We go to church together or cross paths at HEB. Like, we have this same vested interest. This is our town. These are our kids. This is our future. And there's no way that can be shared across the state by any single entity. And so nothing replaces relationships and community and communication. And so I know for me and my staff, we have made it a focused effort to be accessible, available and responsive to any calls that we get. That's the job, and I love the job.
Excellent. And so final question, and I learned about this recently. So there's a superintendent in Texas who recently got indicted for covering up a student-teacher relationship. And the school board recently approved $30,000 of taxpayer dollars to cover her legal fees. When I think about when we approve a bond or a tax increase, that goes to infrastructure, it goes to classrooms, to staffing, but not items like this.
Yeah.
So should this be of concern to taxpayers?
Oh, completely. And this is one of the main reasons that public trust is being undermined with our local schools. And this is why there is a heightened scrutiny around the passage of a bond, because we're hearing about an arrest or an impropriety every other day, unfortunately, in our public schools, or even educators who have access to impressionable children, indoctrinating them with radical ideology that has nothing to do with academics. And so I'm just saying that there is a huge amount of distrust. And so then when we look and say, well, where is our money going? And we see it's going to cover someone else's impropriety or poor decision making, it's really harming ISDs in the long term. And there's got to be trust rebuilt on all levels when it comes to especially parents, and who they're entrusting their kids to.
Well, Representative Hickland, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your leadership.
Thanks.
Until next time, I'm Jose Melendez reminding you it's your money, your government, and your voice.